In previous mathematics courses, you learned about the properties of exponents and how exponents behave and combine with one another. Let's review the product and quotient rules for exponents that you will use as you solve these ready problems. The product rule tells us that when we multiply two powers that have the same base, we can simply add the exponents together. Let's look at a specific example so that we can understand why the product rule works. We'll expand each power out separately before combining them together. The quotient rule tells us that when we divide two powers that have the same base, we can simply subtract the exponents. Once again, let's look at a specific example. Here is an example. Here is another example. In the task that you did today in class, pulling a rabbit out of the hat, you practiced writing inverse functions. You started with an input value and determined the operation or operations needed in order to get an output value that was equal to your original input. You found that writing inverse functions requires you to use the inverse operations that you have practiced on the previous Ready, Set, Go assignments for this unit. For example, if you want to write the inverse function for the function shown here, you must first consider the operations that have been performed on x. Then you undo each operation in the opposite order that they were applied in the original function. In this case, we first raised the x to the third power, then multiplied by 5, then subtracted 7, and finally divided by 14. So the inverse function must first multiply by 14, then add 7, then divide by 5, and finally take the cube root. In Math 1 and 2, you studied quadratic functions and how to solve their equations. There were several methods for solving these equations. One way was to solve by factoring. This was an efficient method, but only worked if the answers were rational. Another method was the quadratic formula. This method required a large formula, but always worked, no matter the type of answer. Let's review both methods. Consider the equation. In order to solve any quadratic, we always want to make sure the equation is equal to 0. Once we have the trinomial, we want to factor it. Now that we have it factored, set each factor equal to 0 and solve. To solve by the quadratic formula, consider the equation. In order to solve any quadratic, we always want to make sure that the equation is equal to 0. Once we have the trinomial, we want to identify A, B, and C. Now we need to use the quadratic formula. First, we want to substitute into the formula our values for A, B, and C. Then we want to evaluate our answers.